Have you ever wondered what is the true meaning of our life? Or perhaps you feel like you're stuck and can't find a way out of your situation. Have you wondered why some unpleasant events repeat themselves? Why are some people more successful than others? Why do we have divisions in society? Why do we have wars? Or perhaps you're wondering if there is life after death. If so, you have come to the right place, because it's in this two-part episode that you will find out or get answers to the deepest and most mysterious questions that man has ever asked himself in the history of our creation. And I am not joking. My dear viewer, thanks to my curiosity and determination in searching for the meaning and purpose of everything, I finally reached the truth of life. The truth that freed me from the bondage of my mind and thus ended my suffering. Therefore today I want to share this truth with you so that you too can free yourself from all pains and worries, and maybe even a lot more than just that. Welcome to my channel and thank you for choosing to watch this video. Dear viewer, before we even get into today's topic, I want you to know that the preparation of this material was an enormously demanding task for me. Demanding, if only because of its rather unusual and difficult to explain, but also to understand subject matter. It took me about 10 years to get to this information, while it took me about 3 to fully understand its deep meaning, but also to implement it into my life and actually start living it. Nevertheless, considering that this is one of the most important topics that unfortunately we are not taught in schools, I decided to accept this challenge and explain it in such a way so that you, dear viewer, understand its enormous importance and influence on our self-development. Because, as you will soon find out for yourself, understanding how our universe works, including our role in it, can really change your entire view on yourself forever, but also in general sense. A view of our existence here on Earth. And when I say ours, I mean the entire human civilization. So, in order to explain our topic in depth, I divided this recording into 2 parts. Where the first part is a purely scientific and therefore more theoretical part, which in fact is an introduction to our topic. And here also I want to mention that even if you don't like this type of lectures, I still recommend you that you take this knowledge, because it will actually help you understand the information that I will give you in the second part of this recording, which by the way is the theoretical and practical part. And so in the second part in turn, I will actually explain the same topic, but in a completely different light, because more in a spiritual sense. And it's also the second part of this recording that I would like us to focus on the most. Okay, so moving on to today's recording. In the first part, I'm going to tell you about the entire structure of our universe. And therefore, I will explain what our universe is and what it consists of. In the same part, I will also explain a certain theory, a theory called string theory, which I hope will result in a much better understanding of how our universe works according to physics and mathematics. In the second part, on the other hand, I'm going to briefly explain each of the 10 dimensions according to the scientific theories of classical as well as quantum physics. And don't worry, I will try to explain everything as simply as I can so that you can easily absorb the information I will give you. Therefore, my dear viewer, open your beautiful mind and allow yourself to absorb this extraordinary knowledge. You have surely heard many different theories in your life about what our universe is. And although we think we know so much about it, it turns out that in reality we know very little. Because whenever it seems to us that we have just proved something significant, suddenly someone new appears who says, you know what? There is much more to it. And they are right. Because our universe is like a powerful machine that has been around for millions, trillions, or perhaps we should simply say since always. And this machine remains in constant motion. And that also means it's constantly creating something new. Therefore, while studying this subject, I realized that science is not and will never be able to give us one correct answer to all the mysteries about the universe. And it won't be able to because science relies on research and experimentation that ultimately provides clear evidence for the existence of something. However, in this case, science turns out to be helpless because in fact, we still have not enough evidence. However, while science cannot prove everything, that doesn't mean that there aren't ways to actually find out and understand how the universe works. Because when we will understand how it works, then we will also understand why we aren't able to fully investigate it. All the more proof what we are investigating. But to understand all the mechanics of how the universe works, it turns out that you will have to open yourself to a completely different kind of knowledge. And this means that you will have to abandon your current beliefs about the theory of our existence. Regardless of whether you are a physicist, an astronaut, a priest, cosmologist, or just an ordinary person. And you will have to abandon them because all these theories we know in reality limit our mind and therefore our understanding and perception. Science believes that the universe is composed of 3 types of substances: normal matter, dark matter, and dark energy, where normal matter takes up less than 10% of the total. Dark matter takes up about 20%, while the rest is said to be dark energy. Of course, these are just assumptions that have never been conclusively confirmed. Because, as well as many scientists stated, the so-called dark energy doesn't even exist. So, as you can see, science leaves a lot to think about. And here comes the question. Is it even important to know all this in detail? Actually not. But despite everything, I sincerely admire all those who devote their entire life to do this research. And I really hope that this is just a great passion. Because in fact, studying the universe from a scientist's perspective is like looking for a needle in a haystack. So let's go further. To begin with, let's first recall what matter actually is. Because I suppose that not all of us remember school times and book definitions. In physics, matter is defined as the totality of existing objects or physical objects recognized by the senses. Matter is made of molecules of atoms and their size is expressed in nanometers, which means billions of meter. And that, as you can certainly imagine, means that they aren't visible under the microscope's magnifying glass. On the other hand, if we talk about matter from a philosophical perspective, we say that it's everything that exists in time and space. So we can say that time and space both are the foundations or basis for the entire creation, and therefore without them, nothing would come into existence. In other words, space in physics means everything that surrounds us, and in which all physical phenomenon is happening. Time, on the other hand, determines the sequence of these events and the intervals between them, occurring in the same place. So, in short, the universe is everything, since it covers all space, including all matter and energy, includes also time, and therefore includes us. And if it includes us, it must also include the Earth and the Moon, like other planets and their dozens of moons. And here, of course, let's not forget about asteroids and comets, or the Sun and hundreds of billions of other stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And since most of the stars have their own planets called exoplanets, they are also part of our universe. And if there is anything else that I haven't mentioned, that's also part of our universe. So, as you can see, there is no separation between us and the universe. Therefore, the statement, "I would like to go to space," sounds as if it was something separate from us. And it's not. Because the truth is that there is only the universe, and we are part of it. And because most scientists also accept the concept of God, which is some kind of higher power, we say that the universe was created by God. But the truth is that God is the universe, or the universe means God. So in this case, it's incorrect to say that the universe was created by God, because in fact, the universe, God, came into existence by itself. And you will learn much more about it in the part 2 of this recording. And I promise to explain it clearly enough. Okay then, let's assume that we already know what the universe is and what it consists of. Or at least we have some supposed data, right? Therefore now, I would like to briefly explain to you a certain theory. A theory called string theory. And here also, I won't be going into detail of this theory. Because the more I dived into all these book definitions, the more I felt that we had strayed too far from the whole truth. To the point where I even said to myself that some people must like to complicate their lives. Completely unnecessarily. Because reading all these physicists' definitions, at one point I had the impression
I was trying to read the hieroglyphics. Nothing made sense.
So, for example, the definition, which should have been fairly simple to understand, with each verse got more and more confusing. So much so that, again, I had the impression that we have completely strayed from the topic. However, I, despite everything, remained committed to further study. And so, a moment later, which by the way means 10 minutes later, it turned out that I had just wasted another 10 minutes of my life, because the definition I just read was eventually challenged by another physicist or a cosmologist, and so the theory has lost its credibility. And what's interesting, I always found the same excuse. Guess what? Too few evidence. And since there are so many such resources to browse through, as you can imagine, I found a lot of completely different theories on the same topic. So, to sum up,
Sisyphean work.
alright, so let's finally dive into the string theory.
String theory is an attempt to explain all the particles and fundamental forces of nature in one theory by modeling them as vibrations of tiny supersymmetrical strings, also called loops because of their open or closed nature. And as an example of an open string, we will give a straight line, while the closed one will be the aforementioned loop.
And here, let me cut in. You will understand this theory much better in the second part, when I will explain it with a real-life example. Okay, so continuing. String theory is an idea of theoretical physics, and it claims that the basic or fundamental building blocks of the world are not zero-dimensional objects or particles, but one-dimensional particles called strings. In other words, reality is made up of an infinite number of tiny vibrating strings smaller than atoms, electrons or quarks, and when the strings vibrate, twist and roll, they produce effects in many smaller dimensions that people interpret as anything from particle physics to large-scale phenomena such as gravity. And interestingly, the size of such string is about 10 to minus 31 meter, which actually gives us a millionth of a billionth of a billionth of a billionth of a centimeter. So, a number that our mind cannot even imagine. On the other hand, the spacetime of strings turns out to require at least 10 dimensions. And this means that in addition to the 3 spatial dimensions or space dimensions and 1 time dimension that we know, string theory predicts at least 6 additional space dimensions. And you will learn about them in just a moment, because in the second part of this recording. What's more, string theory in its further development has also managed to take gravity into account. And as a result, physicists can use this theory to describe how gravity can affect small objects such as electrons or protons, which are the building blocks of the atom. Electrons, negatively charged molecules, and protons, positively charged molecules. However, over the years, this theory, while still providing us with some interesting data, eventually also has been challenged by other physicists, and therefore, as a result, we actually cannot fully rely on it. And that's certainly why we still can't get any concrete data on the mystery of the universe. Or at least science is not able to provide us with it.
As I already mentioned, according to string theory, we live in a world that consists of at least 10 dimensions. And out of these 10, we only know 4, where the first 3 dimensions are spatial dimensions, which, when combined, form a grid or a multi-dimensional space in which, for example, we live. And these are length, width, and height, which is equal to the depth dimension. On the other hand, the 4th dimension that we know is the time dimension, and when combined with the dimensions of space, gives us the dimension of space and time, or space-time dimension. We define the 0 dimension as a point or a dot, which is really the foundation of all other dimensions. That's why we say that this dimension is the most important dimension, because that's where the whole creation actually begins. And as a being living in this dimension, we just are. And that's why, as you can see, I called our point I am, which automatically means that here we cannot move in any direction. In relation to maths, a point is a 0-dimensional surface, and it consists of one vertex, which is itself. A one-dimensional object, as the name says, has only one dimension, which is the length. And here as an example, we will give a straight line or a line segment that can only connect 2 points. So a one-dimensional being can only move in one direction along a straight line. In relation to maths, if we move our point by 1 unit of length, as a result, we will get a one-dimensional line segment with 2 vertices. Two-dimensional objects are known to us as plane figures. And among them there are, for example, squares and triangles, which, as we know, consist of 2 dimensions. And these are length and width. In other words, two-dimensional objects are flat objects that occupy a certain part of the surface with no volume. And so in this case, a two-dimensional figure can only move on a surface. And here as an example, a being living in two-dimensional reality will not be able to see, for example, an apple, which is three-dimensional. And it won't be able to because the two-dimensional perspective makes it unable to perceive what's above or below its two-dimensional plane. Thus, any three-dimensional object that touches its plane will be perceived as just a point that can increase or decrease in size while still remaining flat. In other words, the entity sees only a cross-section of it, which at that moment crosses its two-dimensional plane. So for a being living in two-dimensional reality, higher dimensional objects can appear quite unexpectedly, but also change their shape and size, and then simply disappear in space. In relation to maths, to create a two-dimensional space, we will have to move the segmenting line in the direction perpendicular to itself. And by doubling its vertices, as a result, we will get a two-dimensional square whose number of vertices is 4. Three-dimensional space or reality, or simply the third dimension, is the so-called depth dimension. The depth that gives quality or meaning to reality, which is something that we call real life. A three-dimensional shape can be defined as a solid object or simply a shape that has three dimensions. And these are length, width, and height. And unlike two-dimensional shapes, three-dimensional shapes have a height which is equal to their depth. So, for example, a three-dimensional object can be aforementioned apple, but also a chair, a car, a house, a cube, and even a human.
And here I would like to emphasize a very important issue. Many times I have encountered a question such as, what dimension do we live in? I heard people saying, we live in the third dimension. It sounds as if the dimension was something or some place we can go to and live in. But that's not what it is. So to answer that question, the correct statement is, we live in a three-dimensional space that we call our reality or life. So we don't say in the third dimension.
And so, living in three-dimensional reality, now we can easily move forward, backwards, but also up and down. And this means that we have full control over the three-dimensional space. In relation to maths, to create a three-dimensional space, we will have to double the number of vertices of two-dimensional square. And this will result in three-dimensional cube whose number of vertices equals 8. The fourth dimension is time, and when combined with the dimensions of space, gives us the dimension of space and time, or space and time dimension. And here we can imagine space and time together forming a web or grid within which all events take place, from the birth of the universe and so on to the distant future. So as you can see, each event actually occurs at a certain point in space and at a certain moment in time. And this means that the entity in this dimension of time is free to move around because it has complete control of it. In other words, in this reality, we could move to the past or the future as we like. So let's assume that we are a four-dimensional entity. In this reality, we would be able, for example, to go back to the past and change our decision, for example, regarding our professional career.
Would you like to have such ability? Because I personally wouldn't change anything in my past. But that's only because today I understand the deep meaning of our past experiences. If on the other hand, you had asked me the same question, say 10 years ago, I would have probably answered that being able to change previously made decision would literally be like winning the lottery. Oh well, we can only imagine what it would be like if we could do that. Therefore, let me ask you, does our clinging to old pains, knowing that in reality we cannot change the past, actually make any sense? I don't think so. So my friend, let go of what you cannot change and instead enjoy the ability to move forward.
And since we are already in the fourth dimensional space, it's also worth mentioning about gravity. Gravity is also known as the law of universal gravitation, and as we know, it's naturally occurring phenomenon. And this phenomenon states that all objects that have mass or energy attract each other. And so, according to a theory described by Isaac Newton, between any pair of bodies with masses, there appears an attractive force which acts on the line joining their centers and its value increases with the product of their masses and decreases with the square of the distance between them.
And this was the original version of this theory.
In modern physics, however, it's said that gravity is not an interaction, but actually a consequence of the curvature of space and time by matter. And this consequently causes a cavity in it that curves the four-dimensional grid of space and time. So now let's imagine what happens to objects that occur near this cavity. Due to their mass, they will fall inside. If, on the other hand, we are talking about a four-dimensional space in relation to maths, any object above 3 dimensions is called a hypercube. And although a point, a line segment, a square, or a cube also are, we use this term more often when we refer to a modern 3-dimensional space. So if we add a 4th dimension to our 3-dimensional cube, by doubling its vertices, we will get a 4-dimensional hypercube called a tesseract, whose number of vertices equals 16. From a 5-dimensional perspective, an entity can control time in various ways. So here we would have all the potential abilities of a 4-dimensional entity, but additionally we would have the ability to be in different places at the same time. So, for example, a 5-dimensional entity may do several different activities and have many different interests. And this is because in a 5-dimensional reality, we know about the existence of parallel universes, which means that we can do several different jobs simultaneously. Or, in other words, lead totally independent lives. And that also means we would have separate timelines for each of our lives in all parallel universes.
And here, let me explain what actually is a parallel universe, but also the so-called multiverse. And for this purpose, let me quote words taken from one of the Polish scientific magazines published in 2018.
In an infinite number of alternate realities, there are an infinite numbers of us making choices opposite to those we make in our other lives.
And this is what the proponents of the quantum theory of the multiverse actually believe.
So let's imagine everything that we haven't done in our lives has actually happened in an almost infinite number of alternate scenarios. Hence the feeling called déjà vu, but also our intuitive prompts. How is it even possible that our intuition knows what we should and what we shouldn't do, and yet always turns out to be right? The term multiverse was first introduced in 1960s by Scottish astronomer Andy Nemo. And here, let me cut in. In English, the prefix uni means the only one, and multi means many. Hence, universe means one word, and multiverse means many words. The term multiverse was first used in the 1960s by British science fiction writer Michael Moorcock. In one of his novels, the writer referred to quantum hypothesis of many words by the American physicist Hugh Everett III, who himself called it a somewhat complicated name, namely multiverse interpretation of quantum mechanics. And it assumed that everything that could happen would surely take place in one of the branches of reality. So, in other words, every choice we make in life has its opposite, which must happen in a parallel universe. And a British physicist, David Deutsch, was actually the first to take this hypothesis seriously. He even created his own interpretation of quantum mechanics, which assumed that space is filled with an infinite number of universes, in which we either make the same as in our universe or alternative choices. But that's not all, because over time it turned out that there are also other universes where life never developed. And it is said that most likely there are completely different laws of physics from those that exist in our universe.
So now back to the fifth dimension. Each life we live in parallel universes is based on completely different causes and effects, which are the result of different decisions we make in each of our lives. And the only limitation of five-dimensional reality is that we cannot know our other versions of us directly by using shortcuts to another axis of the parallel universe. What we can do, however, is to go back in time when, for example, we were making a decision that we would like to change now. And when we change it, we will automatically start a new independent life based on our newly made decision.
In relation to maths, to create a five-dimensional space, we will have to double the number of vertices of the four-dimensional tesseract, which will result in a five-dimensional hypercube called the pentaract, whose number of vertices equals 32. Six-dimensional entity has all the abilities of a five-dimensional entity plus some additional ones. For example, such entity can see both the past tense and the future tense, and this time also each of its versions of themselves from parallel universes. The only limitation of six-dimensional reality is that each of the parallel universes must have the same beginning, and this means that it was created in the same way. So, for example, from the Big Bang. According to science, this is the earliest known event in the observable universe. In other words, universal earliest stage of evolution. And according to this theory, about 14 billion years ago, there was a Big Bang in which the universe we know emerged from hot and dense matter.
Thus, each of the parallel universes in six-dimensional reality has the same origin. In turn, such significant difference between the five-dimensional reality and the six-dimensional reality is that in the six-dimensional world, there are no time limits.
And this means that we can move back in time at any moment, and by using shortcuts that are now available, we can directly learn about our older versions experiencing life in a parallel universe.
Therefore, we don't have to go back to the past and change our decisions in order to get to know another possible reality, because now we have shortcuts available. And this means that by using shortcuts, we can experience a different reality directly.
In relation to maths, to create a six-dimensional space, we will have to double the number of vertices in a five-dimensional hypercube, which will result in a six-dimensional hypercube called the hexaract, whose number of vertices equals 64. In a seven-dimensional reality, we additionally know about the existence of other universes. And their beginning, this time, may be different from the others. But also, as I already mentioned earlier, it's said that most likely in each of them prevail completely different laws of physics. And therefore, seven-dimensional entity has all the abilities of a six-dimensional one, plus its own extra ones. And these are, for example, the possibility of taking an infinite number of different forms and the possibility of moving between different universes. In relation to maths, to create a seven-dimensional space, we will have to double the vertices of the six-dimensional hypercube. And as a result, we will have a seven-dimensional hypercube called the hepteract, whose number of vertices equals 128.
The eight-dimensional reality of space has the plane of all possible past, present and future for an infinite number of parallel universes. And this means that all parallel universes extend to infinity. Therefore, string theory claims that an eight-dimensional objects don't take physical form. And after all, it's quite logical. Since you can take any form and so on endlessly, you can't actually limit yourself to one particular form. Thus, the eighth dimension can be considered analogous to our digital world. Analogous means parallel. And more plainly speaking, it's a world where we cannot touch objects, but we can see or hear them. So something that we call the virtual world. And so objects in this dimension, or eight-dimensional objects in this reality or space, can change shape, size, appear and disappear simultaneously or spontaneously.
In relation to maths, to create eight-dimensional space, we will have to double the number of vertices of a seven-dimensional hypercube. And this will result in an eight-dimensional hypercube called the octeract, whose number of vertices equals 256.
In a nine-dimensional reality of space, there is an infinite number of universes. And each of these universes follows its own laws of physics, but also separate conditions and the probability of their emergence, of their beginning. And it's actually in this dimension that other civilizations, such as aliens, are said to inhabit. And so such entities have superhuman abilities. For example, they can travel in time between the past, present, and the future in an infinite number of universes. And they can do it because they don't take physical form. And that's also why we cannot see them with our physical eyes.
In relation to maths, to create a nine-dimensional space, this time we will have to double the number of vertices in an eight-dimensional hypercube, which will result in a nine-dimensional hypercube called MYINNERGUIDANCE, whose number of vertices equals 512.
A 10-dimensional being has infinite superpowers. Such a being can do things that we cannot even imagine. And among other things, it has full control over space and time in each of the infinite universes. And such being is what we call God. Infinite, unlimited, omnipotent, and omnipresent. And here we kind of return to the zero dimension that we said is the basis of everything. In other words, the zero dimension is the dimension where our infinite creation actually begins.
In relation to maths, we can now clearly see that the places where the vertices meet, or the places where the time axis crosses space, visually from a two-dimensional cross-section, they make the centers of all interconnected hypercubes disappear more and more as the number of dimensions increases. So as a result, we understand that although its possibilities are infinite, as the doubled vertices increase, their points of contact eventually merge into one whole. And that means we are going back to where we started. That's why when describing the zero dimension, I said that it's the foundation of the entire emerging creation.
And as we certainly can guess, the number of dimensions can in fact increase indefinitely. However, dimensions beyond the 10th are not perceptible to us, as they are located in the bends of the space-time grid, and therefore we are unable to explore them and prove their existence. And that's why that would be it, my dear viewer. I truly hope that I have brought you a little closer to the picture of how science perceives our multidimensional world. Whereas now, I would like to cordially invite you to the second part of this video, because that's where all the magic will happen. So in the second part, at the beginning I will explain only the first 3 dimensions. And why 3? Because being a 3-dimensional entity, you should first understand the world you live in. And when you understand the world you live in, it will be much easier for you to understand everything that's above. Besides, the information I will give you will surely shake up your world. And so after all, you will need a little more time to digest what you will learn. So once again, I cordially invite you to watch the second part of this recording, where you will learn, among others, who we really are, what is our true origin, what abilities do we have, why is our life the way it is, how could we change our fortune, and a lot more. In the meantime, take care, and until next time, hey!